Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. Thank you for coming. I'm going to not say much about myself. My name is Anthony Alessandrini. I teach in the CUNY system at Kingsborough Community College, where I teach English, and at the Graduate Center, where I teach Middle Eastern Studies. I'm also on the faculty of the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research, and as that I'm representing them, I will just say a quick word about BISR. We do have some material over here, just super quick. The Brooklyn Institute for Social Research is an interdisciplinary teaching and research institute that offers critical community-based education in the humanities and social sciences, working in partnership with local businesses and cultural organizations. We integrate rigorous but accessible scholarly study with the everyday lives of working adults and reimagine scholarship for the 21st century. In a word, what that means is like really amazing classes, mostly in bars, where you get to eat and drink and have like really wonderful conversation. So if you're interested, I'm happy to talk to you afterwards. There's materials up there. But the main thing we're here for, of course, is Kate Evans's extraordinary book, Threads from the Refugee Crisis. I'm just curious, how many folks had a chance to see it yet or read it? This is the launch. I guess people really haven't. I agreed to do this before reading the book, and I have to say, having now read it, I'm so happy to be able to be part of this. It's an astonishing book. So I think the way we're going to run things is Kate will talk about the book for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, like
20.
Yeah, and then I will ask the other panelists, Loubna Mrie and Maryam Jamshidi, to talk for maybe 5 minutes each, and then we will open it up for conversation. So maybe I'll introduce folks as they speak, if that's good. So just to start with Kate. So Kate Evans is a cartoonist, artist, and activist. She's the author of numerous books and zines, including Red Rosa, a graphic biography of Rosa Luxemburg, which was shortlisted for the Bread and Roses Award. Bump, How to Make, Grow, and Birth a Baby. And Funny Weather, Everything You Didn't Want to Know About Climate Change but Probably Should Find Out. Her latest book, which is of course the book we're discussing tonight, is Threads from the Refugee Crisis. It was, even though we're launching it tonight, it has already been awarded the John C. Lawrence Award from the Society of Authors. And it's been described by the great Alison Bechdel, whose work probably many people here know, as gripping and beautiful comics journalism at its finest. And I'm actually going to embarrass her by reading a little more of her blurb. Evans transforms the human flood, in quotes, into shimmering droplets as she works and eats with the refugees, getting to know them as individuals, forging intimate connections while sketching their portraits. Evans both captures the wrenching reality of a seemingly intractable problem and makes an eloquent argument for its solution, open borders. And I think that really does capture much that's beautiful and extraordinary about this book. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Kate Evans. Give us a clap.
I'm going to abandon the microphone because I really don't need one. Oh, I have to have one. Okay. Wrestle it. Okay. Okay, I'm not going to abandon the microphone. Hello, thanks for coming, especially since I brought the weather with me from the UK. Oh, hang on, that is not the beginning of the talk. What a great smooth start that isn't. Everyone shut your eyes, yeah? So, sorry, yeah, smooth. Shall we lose this light as well, because then we can... then everyone can see the graphics better. So I'm here to discuss a full-length graphic novel that I've written about an incredibly brief period of my life, which is that I spent 10 days in total over 3 visits to the Calais refugee camp on the border of France and England. Obviously, the border of France and England is the sea, but it's only 20 minutes. It's only 20 miles from the border of the UK. It's very close. So Calais was always known to me as a place that you would go in the car and you'd go and fill up your car with cheap booze and cigarettes and come back to the UK. You know, we call it a booze cruise. Like, that was the only thing the town was noted for. But I went back in October 2015 and I found out a little more about the place and also how it had changed. The first thing we see, white fences stream along the highway, meters high, miles long. The smooth steel lacework glistens in the evening sun. These are completely new. The entire geography of the port had changed. Fences. Calais. The city was famous for its lace making, the meticulous toil of women and girls sitting outside to make the most of the daylight, nimble fingers, bobbins dancing, continuously twisting the threads. Now, I know that it is possible to do reportage about somewhere without going there, but I think it would be really difficult. I feel when you travel somewhere, you get a sense of the unexpected, of the unknown. And I didn't know anything about Calais being a famous lace-making town, but the minute I found that out, I knew that I had a visual metaphor that was going to ground the book specifically in that place, which is what I was looking for. So I've used lace as borders throughout the work. And the irony of that was not lost on me, because I saved all my little scans of pieces of lace in a folder called No Borders. The jungle. So, again, to give it a bit of context, because the jungle is something that everyone in the UK is familiar with, because the tabloid newspapers give us scare stories about the terrible savages of the jungle who are trying to overrun the UK. So the jungle is a piece of wasteland next to the road leading to the port, where the French authorities have had the deliberate policy of herding up every refugee they can find and making them live in conditions of squalor and desperation, assuming somehow that will make them go away. By October 2015, which was a year that 1 million refugees arrived in Europe, it had grown to really something quite remarkably horrible. But anyway, it's massive. Oh my. I don't know what I thought I'd see, but I didn't expect this. So many people, so much need. A microcosmic disunited nations. Over here is Afghanistan, and over there is Sudan, and Eritreans, and Syrians, and Iraqis. And politicians call them a flood. But of all the people, millions of people around the world fleeing for their lives, this is just a trickle. Maybe 5,000 human beings? Nobody knows exactly. Nobody is counting. These people don't count. Everywhere there is an air of expectation, of an impermanence. People who've been on the move for so long are stuck in limbo, tantalizingly close to their destination, but the wrong side of those cruel fences, still so very far. There is no free movement of safe passage for refugees across borders. And within Europe, there is a regulation that you have to claim asylum in the first safe country that you come to. So when people have a reason for coming to the UK, and the reasons that they give have been documented, including family reunion, including the fact that you speak the English language, including the fact that, hey, we seem to have started some wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, so don't seem to have got around to finishing. So because they have to stay under the radar, you're seeing people who have had no contact with any authority or any official thing, and they're still then try get as far as Calais, and then the only way to go from there on is to pay a people smuggler, or to hide in the back of a lorry, or to attempt to jump onto the moving Eurostar train. Oh, I had to crop this, by the way. It originally said, "You are from the UK, yes? You can help us come to the UK, yes?" And then we got like, sorry, but I had to crop it down to fit it in the PowerPoint presentation, and now it just says, UK, yes, sorry. And I thought, that's really like English people. We just apologise all the time for anything. Like, somebody would punch it, and if you punch an English person, they will apologise to you. So I kept that in. And also, on that subject, I don't believe that women should apologise for their work, because I think we do it too often. However, the drawing's actually quite bad at the beginning of the book here. Partly because I had like a week to do it, and it was school holidays, and I didn't have any childcare, and I was just like buffed this down after my initial visit to the jungle, just as a blog post. I wasn't intending it for publication. And I wondered whether I should go back and rework the artwork to something that's more representative of how well I can draw. But I decided that the style suits the subject matter, so I've deliberately left it as it is. There are a lot of smiles, which I didn't expect. Everywhere, little interactions, points of connection, life's threads crossing. Today, we're helping to build shelters with a limited number of hammers, 8-foot square plastic shacks. it's better than a tent. My white privilege grants me the job of guarding the tool tent. We can give out a small handful of nails. I just want a lock. It's not up to me. He's worked all day, but I can't give it to him. We have 3 padlocks in a box and thousands of people wanting them. However pointless it may be, locking the door of a dwelling when you can slit the sides with a Stanley knife, everyone wants to feel secure. Shabab is here alone. He's 12 years old, the same age as my son. He's growing up far too fast. He doesn't look sad, but I never see him smile either. We help him build his house. He's competent with a hammer and over-enthusiastic with a staple gun. My son wouldn't know how to use a hammer unless it was on Minecraft. I give him some grapes out of a maternal concern for his vitamin intake. I feel an urge to scold him for treading down the back of his shoes, but then I realise that everyone does it. It's a sandal-wearing culture. That'll change when winter starts to bite. So that's a brief taste of a longer cartoon that I did based on a very brief visit that's fixed in a particular moment in time, October 2015, as winter is about to draw in. And I uploaded it to the internet, and it went viral, and it crashed my website, and I got a lot of feedback, and some was from people who visited Calais or other refugee camps, and that was overwhelmingly positive. People were saying, well, thank you for showing what's happening. And some was like, you know, generally appreciative, but not all of it was. This cartoon could not be better propaganda for battlefield veteran Islamic militant males invading Northern Europe if Lenin himself had produced it. The situation would not exist if they very people breaking laws in Calais did not ruin their homelands with ethnic, religious hatred, intolerance, and war. You are importing death. Now, I am quite pleased that my work has elicited this comment, yeah? I'm not like, I don't want to be a target for internet troll hate, but I've incorporated these hostile comments throughout the narrative. Now, some of them are made in direct relation to my work, and some of them I went looking for on the internet. And I've chosen all of them to sort of, as counterpoints to the narrative I'm showing. You know, the stories that I tell prove the lie to these hostile comments, where people are saying, like, what are these comments from trolls? And I don't believe this is a troll. This person hasn't written this in response to my work because they're trying to wind me up or provoke a reaction. This is somebody's sincerely held belief. I think it's very interesting encountering beliefs that I disagree with. I like to try and look at the underlying rationale for why it would be that anyone could think that that would make sense, and then I like to try and address the rationale behind it. Like, that's the game that I play. I'm trying to find the common ground, you know, and unpicking the statements. Oh, you think all hippies are lazy? Okay, after I finish my 14-hour day of drawing cartoons, I'll get back to you about that. Yeah, so, but also what I really like about this comment is, about the facts of this comment, is that, okay, so a bunch of people saw my comic who were already converted. They already knew about refugees. And then this person wrote, and that's what they believe about refugees. But in the middle, there must have been a bunch of other people who didn't know anything other than what they read in the Daily Mail. And hopefully, with those people, I will genuinely change some people's minds. Anyway, so this is a comment about the power of cartoons in a way, and partly in response to it, I printed 20,000 copies of that first blog post up as comics and distributed them as I crowdfunded for the printing costs and then distributed them to be sold in order to raise money for grassroots refugee relief. This is what 20,000 comics look like. If you look on the far right of the picture, there's my beer. So I had to get rid of the comics before we could get to the beer. So that was an incentive. And the rest of the picture you can see is just mess, because my house is very messy, because I have children and I'm a comics artist. And I don't believe it's possible to do it any other way. So yeah, the power of comics. I knew I was going to go back to Calais. Like, everybody who I had ever spoken to about Calais says, oh, when are you going back? They don't say, are you going back? They go, when are you going back? So I decided to go back, and this time, I mean, I didn't like turn up and go, hey, it's okay, the cartoonist's here. But I did ask whether my artwork would be useful. And so I was invited, while I was there, to go to the youth centre and highlight the situation of some of these unaccompanied children. This lad is either 13 or 14 years old. It's an intimate thing to do, to draw a portrait, to sit and study every feature of a face. The impossibly thick eyelashes. See, I can draw, by the way. I can draw better than at the beginning there. The soft, downy hair growing on the upper lip. The strangely massive Afghan hands. The kid's ears are slightly furried too, very small and rounded. They look padded. I idly wonder if he has his mother's ears. And then I wonder how long it is since she last saw him. And I think of her thinking of him every hour of every day. So another thing that you can do if you go somewhere and drew comics, I'm sorry about this clicking, is that you can create a picture of someone's life. And there's something uniquely useful about that with regards to refugees, because you can't document anyone officially in Calais. You could maybe film their lives without showing their faces and disguising their voices, but the minute you make a record of the fact that somebody was at the jungle, that could be used against them in their UK asylum application. They could say, oh, I'll bugger off back to France. So what I can do is I can introduce you to people. You can see what happened through my eyes, but I can change faces and change names and preserve people's anonymity and combine characters and conflate them, but still tell actual human stories. Let's meet Hoshiyar. We all squeeze into Hoshiyar's hut. So this is one of the little 8-foot square plastic tarpaulin boxes that we were building earlier. Come in, come in. Kick your shoes off, and there's only one place to go, a softly padded 7-foot square space. This is Alaz, who lives here too. 2 grown men in an 8-foot shack. They each have a sliver of broken mirror tacked up to shave by. It's well insulated. It would be warm-ish, except we have to leave the door open to let in some light. I'll make you lunch. It's not a question. Hoshiyar busies himself in his 18-inch kitchen, knocking 2 eggs together and tipping them into a pan. The sadness temporarily ebbs from his face in the process. Welcoming, cooking, sharing. You can tell this fits with his sense of how things should be in the world. We play the let's show each other our families on our phones game. Hoshiyar's turn. Here is my mother, my sister, her children. My family home, here. The contrast with Hoshiyar's current view is stark. What must it be like to feel homesick for somewhere it's not safe for you to be? And this is the making a cup of tea with 6 sugars in it panel. Hoshiyar, how are you? How am I? I don't know. What do I say? He doesn't even want to be here. The plan is to join his uncle in Croydon, but the longer it takes, the more often he fails to catch that elusive lorry, the harder it becomes to even try. There is a big European meeting at the end of the month. They will work out how to help refugees, yes? The enormity, the immediacy of the problem is so clear to Hoshiyar that it seems obvious that politicians must want to help. But Hoshiyar, refugees can't vote. Didn't you know immigrants are always feared, always vilified? They hate you, Hoshiyar. They think you're a terrorist. That's what we don't say. Now, I've done comics on a variety of different subjects, and I often do public speaking that's related to them. And I have stood in front of an international symposium of Rosa Luxemburg scholars and showed them a comic about the life of Rosa Luxemburg. And I have stood in front of an enormous national midwifery conference, and I have showed midwives a cartoon that explains how physiological birth works, yeah? And I don't feel any particular difficulty with that, but I do find this subject very difficult to talk about for the simple and obvious fact that we should not necessarily be hearing about the refugee crisis from a middle-class white woman. And there's something incredibly apolitical in a lot of the narrative of refugee relief. It fits very squarely, particularly within British culture, of the lady of the manor, distributing largesse to the poor beggars. And we also have the narrative of the good immigrant, like the worthy beggar, not like the sturdy beggar, the migrant. Not like the person who's coming here to, save their lives because otherwise they'd die of starvation. They can only be here if they save their lives because they would otherwise die of bombs or political persecution. These kinds of divisions that echoes political narratives which are quite problematic. Like, here I am, like an idiot, standing in a kebab shop in Brighton saying, I was at the Calais jungle. I was volunteering to a poor Syrian guy who's probably thinking, oh dear, let's just give her the kebab and get her out of here. It's not a fucking day trip. Fuck misery tourism. What are we doing? Swanning about Calais, congratulating ourselves on our fabulous relief effort. It's not about a bunch of white middle-class do-gooders off on a charity holiday. I'm a graphic novelist. People expect my work to be accessible for children, yeah? So I was like Rosa Luxemburg, I put oral sex in, so that's out of the question. And it's under a sheet. I think it's quite tasteful, but still. And this one I was like, oh, maybe I shouldn't put the swearing in so they can put it in schools. And then I was like, fuck that shit. I cannot possibly fucking talk about the situation without swearing because it absolutely demands it. And this is an issue. So there's a massive volunteer effort providing, alleviating the desperate situation of people who are being ignored by the authorities, who are being deliberately targeted by the authorities, who are being brutalized by the police. And you wonder whether that's actually helping. It's letting the French government off the hook, if you like. And my friend genuinely said this. You wonder if you're doing the right thing. A relief effort, it's just a sticking plaster, isn't it? They made me change that to Band-Aid. Okay. A relief effort is just a Band-Aid. That's not what she said. She said sticking plaster. Anyway, and I said, well, it's only like that in that it would hurt a lot of people if you suddenly removed it. But... And there's these points where you enter into a situation in good faith because you want to connect with people, but then you end up reinforcing inequalities. This is me standing by the outside of the dome where they're distributing goods inside it, and there's this, and it's all meant to be being handed out to kids, and there's this young man, and he's like, please give me one chance, I want to go through, one chance, let me go in, the things. And here I am, guarding the things, stopping the guy from getting to the things, and I feel like the police or another border agent. And how did I suddenly become co-opted into something where I'm reinforcing power structures that I thought I was going to be able to challenge? And it's not a story, it's reality, yeah? And when I turned up in Calais, I didn't go, hey, it's okay, the cartoonist's here. Yeah, but that means I didn't get prior consent. I didn't turn around to the people that I was talking to. If I'd gone in with a vest saying BBC or, hi, I'm here from The Guardian, people would have known that their events were then going to become public property. I was going to create a narrative about them. And I didn't know I was going to write a book about this. So I didn't ask people's permission ahead of time. I have subsequently sent sketches to people via Facebook Messenger, and they've sent me back a smiley face emoticon. But does that really count as consent? And I do think that's problematic, and I will highlight it, because this genuinely happened. My friend, who is a midwife, said to me, when we were driving down a road from Dunkirk to Calais, I'm going to tell you something, and I want it to remain confidential. And I genuinely said, I won't draw a cartoon about it, I promise. And I lied. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kate. That was brilliant. And thanks for giving us just a taste of the... So I'm going to turn now to the panelists to say a couple of words, and then we'll open it out for discussion. And maybe I'll just introduce them one at a time, if that's okay. So Loubna Mrie is a Syrian activist who participated in the initial stages of the Syrian revolution while I have to put my glasses on, sorry. I just started using these, sorry. Who participated in the initial stages of the Syrian revolution while she was based in Latakia and Damascus, before being forced to flee to Turkey in August 2012. She later became a photojournalist with Reuters based in Aleppo, where she covered the ongoing conflict in the Idlib, Aleppo, Latakia, and Hama governorates. Originally from the Syrian coastal city of Jebla, she is currently based in New York City, where she is a researcher and commenter on Syrian and Middle Eastern affairs, as well as an MA student in Near Eastern Studies at New York University. Her work has been published in the Washington Post, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, and the New Republic, among other publications.
Thank you so much, Kate, for this brilliant book. I would call it painful, not brilliant and painful at the same time, because I think it's very important to highlight the journey and the difficulties that refugees go through. But I have a couple of comments, and I really wanted to speak first about the thing that kind of like the hatred thing that people often link the immigrants to Islamic State or extremism. And I think this is extremely understandable due to the media today, thanks for them. Because after 2014 and 2015, there was like this crazy obsession with ISIS, and in my opinion, that was the main reason why refugees, Syrians and Iraqi in particular, are always linked to ISIS. I don't know what to say, but I would say that it's understandable, as one of the one of your characters said that refugees are feared, and I completely understand that, because in 2004, when Iraqi refugees started to come to the country, to Syria, Syrians were not happy with them. I mean, like, not all of them, but of course there was like fear towards, fear from, sorry, English is not my first language, fear from the refugees, and here I'm talking about Iraq and Syria. We shared borders, we speak the same language, and so what do you expect from a person who doesn't really know where Syria is on the map? The only thing they know about Syrians is, okay, this is where ISIS videos are coming from. So I kind of relate to that, and I kind of understand where this fear coming from, and believe it or not, I always get jokes about ISIS, which is not funny. And but yeah, it's very understandable that people don't really know where we are coming from, and they don't know anything about our culture. And again, the media played a major bad role in all of this. And I feel most of the refugee stories kind of were treated as like a pitch always. Pitch story. Yeah, I think that there is always like this selectivity in covering the refugee issues. It's either you have to be too sad or you have to be too successful to be covered by the media. I would say that Syrians or refugees, like any other nation in the world, we have nice, smart people, we have lame people, we have hipsters. No, not too many hipsters. But like my point is just to say that yeah, I'm kind of bitter with the media and the way they cover the refugee crisis. And yeah, and I honestly think that we should have more personal stories, more personal narratives. Most of the media work kind of dealt with the numbers more, like not personal stories, you know, like now probably anyone who would think about the refugee crisis, they would think about like the numbers, or just like a sad picture from Greece, or...
Can I come back on two of those points? Yeah, I kind of share your distaste with mainstream media, because I started out as an environmental activist living in a tree on the route of a road. Like, we used to live in trees and then they'd cut them down and build roads. That was the basic deal. So we were the subjects of the media lens. So I never viewed myself as a journalist. And the second point, you're saying more personal stories. I mean, as a volunteer, we were explicitly told not to ask people for their stories, which is what like some journalists would go in and do. They'd find a vulnerable young Afghan teenager, ask him about the worst events of his life, and then give him a chocolate bar. And so I explicitly don't use, or I didn't inquire about and haven't also incorporated any backstory on any of the characters there. I simply talk about the moments where I meet them as people in their own right in that situation, because that's sort of enough. And then I've anonymized the whole idea of the backstory by pulling together some very anonymous quotes, which are used to sort of contextualize all the stories and take it to a different level. But I've separated those from the actual people, because I feel like there's almost too much, and now let's hear about your tragic events, and let's hear about your tragic events, and yet it's not even denting the compassion fatigue that people are feeling. So I deliberately separated those two ideas in the narrative.
I want to say one last
Sorry.
thing. Yeah,
Didn't
actually,
break your throat.
no. I really like the point about the tourism thing, because we actually started to see that like in early 2013. So by 2015, when kind of the tourism became really hip, those tourists kind of, some of them got beaten up, sadly, because like people just like got so sick of those misery tourists. But in my personal opinion, and I might be wrong, I think like any help would be kind of helpful. And as Syrian, I don't feel like we have the privilege of pick and choose between, you know, like people who are sincere in their relief work, or people who are just there to understand what's going on. But I completely agree with you on the misery stuff. That's it.
That's great. Thank you so much. I'm going to bring in our third panelist, Maryam Jamshidi, who is the founder of Muftah.org, a digital magazine focusing in part on domestic and international issues affecting the countries in the Middle East and North Africa region. And are also one of the co-sponsors tonight, so we'll let her maybe say another word or two about them. She also serves as acting assistant professor of lawyering at the NYU Law School, and is an affiliated faculty member at NYU's Kevorkian Center for Near Eastern Studies. As a lawyer and writer, she has nearly 10 years' experience working on issues related to the Middle East and North Africa. Her writing has appeared in media outlets such as Al Jazeera English and Truth Out. And she's also written a number of academic articles on transitional justice and the Arab world, with a focus on the International Criminal Court. And as part of her work on transitional justice, she's the author of the book, The Future of the Arab Spring, Civic Entrepreneurship in Politics, Art, and Technology Startup, which looks at the role of civil society in regional countries in transition. So I'll turn it over to her.
Thank you, Tony, and to Kate and to Loubna, and obviously to Verso for hosting this event. So very briefly, Muftah, if you haven't heard of it, go online and learn more about it. It's, I think, a pretty interesting publication, been around for 7 years. And our mission is to fix what the mainstream media has broken, which is a coverage on the Middle East and North Africa primarily, as well as Central Asia and Eastern Europe, by actually talking about these countries from an indigenous perspective, which means not only giving a platform to people from those countries or that are originally from those countries to talk about them, but also profiling the work of academics, real experts who understand those countries in a way much deeper than Jennifer Rubin. So anyway, I'm not going to talk very much about the media. I'm actually going to be a lawyer a little bit and talk to you about the law, because I think that often gets lost. In fact, that regularly gets lost in conversations about this issue, because there is a very robust legal framework. It's primarily based in a convention that was written in the early 1950s in response to World War II, the Refugee Convention. It's the most comprehensive set of laws on the international level on refugee issues. And that convention came out of a real I think, a sense of moral failure that was connected to World War II, and the insight that all individuals deserve and have the right to flee from persecution. If they're being persecuted, they should be allowed to leave the place where they're being persecuted and find shelter somewhere else. So the convention defines what a refugee is, which you're probably vaguely familiar with, since it's sort of obvious, but just to rehash it, it's anyone who cannot or will not return to their country of origin because they have a well-founded fear of persecution based on their race, their religion, membership in a social group, or political opinion. So this includes people who are fleeing from war. The convention the convention doesn't require any country to affirmatively take in a certain number of refugees or anything like that. But it arguably also doesn't allow countries to actively try to prevent refugees from coming inside of their countries. It has provisions that expressly state that countries shall not discriminate against or punish or return refugees to their home countries. So arguably, building a wall on your border for the purpose of keeping out refugees would be discriminating against refugees under the convention. So the convention also gives a lot of other very specific rights to refugees. Again, it is framed in terms of the state's obligations, so the obligations that states owe to these refugees. And they include things like minimum conditions for housing, employment, public education, health. All the things you see being violated at the Calais jungle are things that the convention expressly requires that states give to refugees within their borders. So who's a signatory to this convention? Lots of countries, hundreds of countries. Well, maybe not hundreds, but over 100, around 150. Definitely the UK, definitely France. So the countries you see profiled in this book are obligated under this convention to provide certain minimum adequate conditions to the refugees within their borders, but they don't, right? And how do they avoid doing this? They primarily avoid doing this, I would argue, through this rhetoric of national security, and primarily a rhetoric of national security that's focused on the war on terror. So you mentioned, you pulled up, or either you pulled it up or you spoke about Hoshiar.
Not his real name.
Not his real name. And a comment that one of you, I think, made to him about how they think he's a terrorist, right? And
well, that's what we didn't say to him. Those were the unspoken
gotcha,
words. Yeah.
Exactly, right. But that is the subtext, right? That's the subtext to a lot of the policies that you see happening. And especially not even the subtext. It is the explicitly stated by many politicians, like Marine Le Pen, that these are the reasons why we shouldn't be allowing these people into our country. So this national security paradigm is a big problem, and I would say it's at the foundation of the refugee crisis. And in order to address the refugee crisis, I think we need to shift that narrative in a massive way. And it's not easy, but without doing it, we can't really, I don't think, make a dent in this problem. Unfortunately, a lot of those who advocate, like real advocates, people who are working for refugee organizations, couch a lot of their arguments in national security terms. They say things like, well, but there have been no terrorist attacks by refugees, or very few refugees have ever done anything, even within the realm of terrorist activity within the United States. Primarily, you hear these arguments. Or, if we discriminate against refugees based on, their religion or their race, that will actually put us even more under threat, right? While these arguments are understandable, they reinforce this narrative. And I mean, frankly, we see them being made, and where have they gotten us? Those arguments haven't really convinced, at least my government. In fact, they've worked in quite the opposite direction, right? Where they've doubled down on the national security paradigm.
You're still using the two words Muslim and terrorist in the same sentence, even if you're using it to say, not a terrorist. You're
right.
Still, the word association is still there.
Absolutely, they're still associated. So I think that if you truly, as I said, if you truly want to actually try to do something meaningful about the refugee crisis, you need to change the language you use, and we need to really shift how we think about this concept of national security. There is another concept that started to develop in the 90s and has had sort of a slower journey since 9/11 of human security, which basically redefines the concept of security not around the nation state, but around people. And frankly, I would argue the way at least this government and this country talks about national security is actually human security. Because the things that the US government tells the American people to justify many of the things they do in the national security space is that this is for your safety. This is for your safety, the safety of you, your children, the reason we need you to stand in front of these body scanners in the airport, all of the reason we need to read your metadata is to protect you, okay? Which is essentially another way of talking about human security. But it's the wrong way of doing it, right? Because it ultimately benefits the government and it doesn't really benefit people. What human security does is it obligates states to actually put the person front and center when talking about security issues, and to take a more comprehensive approach to security-based issues. It also obligates them not to just be concerned about their citizens, but all human lives. One thing that governments do a very good job of, in addition to building walls to keep people out, is to make it very difficult for people to get refugee status, because at the end of the day, it is a legal status. It's unfortunately not a moral status, it is a legal status. And one way, so they refuse to give that status, and thereby, by not giving that status, are not obligated to provide for the sorts of things that the convention lists, right? But what human security does is it essentially makes that designation meaningless, right? Because it doesn't matter whether or not you've been designated as a refugee. You're a human being deserving of a certain level of care and dignity, of certain basic provisions and rights. And so as a state, under this concept, we're obligated to provide it to you. I mean, the convention is still relevant because it sort of goes into more detail, and again, states are still obligated under the convention to provide certain things to refugees, but it creates a much more expansive framework for thinking about the kinds of things states have to do to take care of not just the people who are, who have a piece of paper that say they are citizens, but people more broadly, especially those who are at their borders or inside their countries in places like Calais. So that's essentially my spiel on the refugee crisis, and the things I see reflected in your cartoon, sort of highlighting the role of these really pervasive national security focused excuses for treating people like this and dehumanizing them.
While we're on the subject of widening the discussion out, which I really, you're spot on here. However, there's actually an aspect of the refugee crisis which is ignored in my book, in that when I was in Calais, I met Iraqi Kurds and Afghani children. Those are the people that I met, and those are the people that I made the story about. And there is an artistic, and I met a few Syrian people as well, but there is an artistic coherence to that, in that I was writing for the British market. So talking about Iraq and Afghanistan has a particular poignancy. I mean, our troops have been out there, and our empire invaded those countries 100 years ago. Like, they were part of the British Empire. So they've had a century of involvement with British meddling, which has created this situation. However, I didn't meet any Sudanese people. There's one Ethiopian guy who I name-checked really near the beginning, but it's the briefest of conversations. Actually, I did meet an Eritrean woman, but she didn't make it into the comic. Make the final cut. She's so lovely. So we've got two narratives. One is the Syrian, Middle Eastern terrorist narrative, and the other one is the invading black African hordes. Yeah. Especially since the borders have been tightened, quote unquote. They're shooting people on the Turkish border, so kids, and on the Hungarian border, kids. Anyway, but especially since the routes across Greece have been and Turkey have been made so impossible, now more people are coming through Egypt and through Libya, and the refugee smuggling transition routes across Africa, from sub-Saharan Africa and up through Libya, has resulted in more dangerous crossings, larger numbers of African people coming proportionately and arriving in Italy. And there's this other narrative of these invading, swamping, dangerous blackness. And then we get a racism within the discussion of refugees as well, which prioritizes the Syrians as the civilized and rich and well-spoken people, middle-class refugees, but sees the sub-Saharan Africans as other again, and you get people who are not interested in talking about African refugees. And I haven't helped much in writing a book which isn't about, doesn't include black African voices fairly or at all in it, purely because that's the way it happened. So that was my broadening it out a bit thing. I mean, your narrative of human security completely makes sense in those terms, but then we have to specifically address economic migration, because this is another great bugbear, because as the globe becomes more destabilized, it's not just the military interventions that are going to be the military-industrial complex that is causing these refugees. That is not the only engine of refugees.
Of course,
We need to be talking about climate change and the ways in which entire nations are going to become uninhabitable.
And this concept is really focused on creating those linkages, you know, not just talking about refugees qua the convention of refugees, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, so you have, so I'm talking mostly about your book, right, and who you focused on, and you focused mostly on those individuals.
Well,
right?
Islamic militant males.
Right.
Yeah.
But this concept is not limited to just those individuals, right? It really includes all people, which is why, you know, many have criticized it for perhaps being too expansive, you know, and too ambiguous. But nevertheless, like, if you can at least you get with me to the point where, like, you know, maybe having something that's a bit more human-centered is more helpful if we truly want to bring security to a broad range of individuals, then categories of people like economic migrants or environmental refugees from climate change, all of these sorts of things are equally, they equally fall under this rubric, right? Because the way it defines security is not just in terms of politics, right? It defines it in terms of economic security, it defines it in terms of environmental security, it defines it across the board, and really emphasizes how all those things are connected to each other.
What do you think about removing the idea of no borders?
So I actually think that if you want to get to no borders, you first have to do this. I think no borders is, I mean, all of this is very radical, and I use that in a positive way, not a negative way, but I think in order to get to no borders, you cannot get there where the nation is still at the center of, you know, well, how we conceive of so many things, but security as well, right? So individuals also identify their security very much with the nation state, right? Because their country is the only one that's going to protect them. That's the way we conceive of human security now, is that if the nation is secure, then the individuals that live inside of it are secure, right? We need to shift that, because all it's done, well, not all it's done, but a lot of what it's done is erode individual rights, and I would argue individual security, for the sake of strengthening the state, and actually strengthening the state's security, but again, at the expense of individuals. If we can get past this idea that nation states are responsible, you know, only for their citizens, by having a framework of security that makes them responsible for essentially all people under their jurisdiction, citizen or not citizen, and maybe even those that are not under their, you know, formal jurisdiction within the border, then I think we can start to get people thinking about actually bringing those borders down in a meaningful way.
I mean, it sort of became a thought exercise for me throughout the book. I mean, I started very much from the personal, and then it sort of grew out to the political. And over the course of writing the book, I began to think more deeply about no borders. Before then, it just used to be, it's an anarchist catchphrase. I never really thought about the reality of what it means, the fact that we have rich nations and we have poor nations. And the walls between them, the apartheid that we're talking about, the inequality, the way that that is reinforced. Obviously, as a British subject, I've been the beneficiary of that my whole life, like the inbuilt inequality of the way that the British Empire had meant we're the fifth richest nation in the world. And it just made me think, God, if you say no borders now, people are just like, oh, what an insane idea. And then like 200 years ago, if you'd said, you know, female equality with men, people would go, oh, don't be ridiculous. And it's the same thing. I kind of feel like, very much hopefully, in a couple of 100 years' time, people are going to look back and go, what were they on? I mean, part of the argument that I use to challenge to introduce the ideas of no borders or of free movements of peoples within the book is the one of the logic of it within capitalism. Is that if people are systematically massacred and if they are murdered and if they die of famine, it is a massive waste of human resources, of the actual resource of the human being. Whereas if you remove the borders between states, they mathematically model it, you increase human productivity. The way that they measure this is global GDP. And the models show that it increases by between 50 and 150%. So you could say it doubles it. But the other thing that it would do is it would be massively egalitarian in that if you have free movement of people, not just free movement of capital, which is what we have now, then people will be able to move from poor to rich places, and they will also be able to return to their homelands in poor places, because one of the things that instituting a border does is it means that once you have the precious thing of the citizenship of the rich nation, you then lose your ability to freely return to the poor nation. Well, one of the most, the remittances that are sent by immigrants back to their home countries massively dwarfs the official aid program of nation states. So if you have the place where people can move freely around the world, then it will equalize. It will equalize the massive inequalities. So once you see that, then you can really see these borders for the massive human injustice that they are.
Yeah, no, I think that
Oh, thank you. I'll just get you to come round with me for the whole of the rest of the tour to North America, if that's all right. Yeah, great, okay.
I also agree with you. I think that there are all sorts of arguments, right, that you can level. One's based in economic arguments, one based in like security-based arguments, obviously in moral arguments. You have some concrete examples. You used to have at least the EU and the experiment that was and continues to be, hopefully, of not having borders and how both the benefits and the challenges that come with that, right? I think we have to be realistic that it is not, the most easy sell to get people who have now gotten used to having, something called a border and a nation state to start automatically and very easily embracing this idea of giving all that up. Again, because I think people associate so many benefits with that status, some of which are in fact true, but some of which aren't, right? And so thinking, from my perspective, it is about the narrative that you create, right? And the arguments that you make first and foremost. And what's really going to resonate with people is obviously also going to depend upon the culture that you're talking to, all of it, the moment in time. There was that when we can maybe talk about this. I don't know if you are interested, but I guess it was 2015. I think it was 2015. The child, the Syrian child that washed up on the shore.
Kurdi, yeah.
Yeah, and the reason I bring that up is because there are these moments, right, when you can have these conversations, and there were all sorts of problematic things about the way that story was covered, all sorts of really problematic things. But there are opportunities, where you can start pushing the conversation in the right direction, but you have to be prepared with the right kind of narrative and know who you're talking to in order to be able to do that.
And before we do the last, I just wanted to, if I may, just throw in really quickly the question of the book, which, another way to say it is like the question of, graphic journalism, comics journalism. And so, Kate, if you wanted to talk a little bit about, you could have written this, I know you do this, but you do other things too, right? So what it is about this format that you think, and then that you think can contribute, right, to the kind of conversation that we're having now. And then Loubna and Maryam, as folks who, of course, have been closely involved with this issue, your reaction to seeing it represented in this particular kind of way, and again, like what art, what literature, what this kind of combination can contribute to opening up some of the questions we've been talking about today.
Well, I already addressed one of the ways in which graphic novels are a good way to talk about narratives from a good way to, so some of the ways in which, some of the advantages of the medium. Thank you, it's a really good question. One is that you get to meet people. It's a very human medium. You can see people's expressions at the same time as you can hear their words. And I kind of think of myself as like a movie director, more so with Rosa, my previous book about Rosa Luxemburg. It's a biography and it's a historical biography. But I was basically creating docudrama dialogue. So it's like I've got little axes and I can change every single aspect of their expression. And that's something that I was able to do with threads. There's kind of giving you, like, when you get to this page in the book, yeah, it's not a good picture. She's pregnant, the riot police have come into her home, and they've started to, they slap her in front of the children. It really happened. And I was drawing it, I knew I wanted them to be full-page panels. So basically, I have all these techniques at my disposal that will emphasize what has just happened. But one thing, I knew they were going to be full-page panels, and then because it's going over 2 pages, there's 3 slaps, that's what happened. So that's 1, 2, and 3. But then because of the page divide, I had to make 4 panels. But what I did here was I gave her the ability to look back into the riot cop's eyes. I gave her a moment of defiance. And that's really good to be able to do. You can give people agency. You can give them agency beyond the narrative. There's this bit where I'm buying a dinner in a restaurant in the jungle, and I'm just being a bit of a knob, and you can see from the look on the face of the guy who's serving me, he's like, oh God, she's a bit of an idiot, isn't she? And that's where the comedy is. I can throw jokes against myself. I can give you an ability to see, and because it's so labor intensive, every single aspect of everything, I've got time to really, really overthink it, if you like, but to make every inch of that count. So even though it's a bit of a, like, I mean, I drew the book in 10 months straight, and that doesn't really include any weekends. I work right the way through when I do it. I take 6 hours to do a page. I have to do 2 pages a day of the roughs, and that's 6 hours each, and then 2 pages a day on the artwork, 6 hours each. So that's 12-hour days. So it's super, super labor intensive, but the finished products you've got so much control over. So those are some of the ways in which I hope the medium can work. I'm quite sniffy about other graphic novelists sometimes. I don't like the way that comics tend to put dots for eyes, because I feel like you've just lost the windows of the soul there, guys. Draw it properly. On the other hand, people have criticised my artwork for being a bit rough and ready, and that's partly a function of the fact that I do work so quickly. I've got kids, I just boshed them out because I can't afford the luxury, especially with this because it was contemporary events. I felt I couldn't afford the luxury of spending 3 years drawing this book.
I think this medium is so incredibly powerful for issues that people have a lot of very strong feelings about. Because I think that what's so incredible about something like this is that it takes the issue, it takes the topic, and it reduces it down to its very essence, you know? This is not an academic text, right, about the refugee crisis. It is a picture book, you know? And so you have to simplify things, you know? And that's not easy to do. But I think simplifying it helps to sort of not to take the emotion out of it, but to sort of crystallize what really should be at the heart, right, of the conversations we're having about these issues. So I think that's incredibly powerful. I also think, and you kind of mentioned this, like kind of zooming in and zooming out of the, you know, who you focus on, when you focus on an individual as opposed to focusing on a group, because the book does both, right? You have the sort of the refugees writ large, then you have the individuals. And I think that's really important because oftentimes, especially in the media coverage of this, you have one or the other, but you don't have both. And so on the one hand, it can sometimes feel like you're talking about these refugees as if they are this faceless horde. On the other hand, it feels like, well, why are we only talking about this one refugee? And then this one refugee becomes fetishized, right? Like the father in Turkey, the Syrian father in Turkey who was selling colored pencils, who became, I think he got something, some insane Kickstarter or something was started, raising like 6 figures just for this individual, which was wonderful, right? But what about the bigger issue? Helping this one person is so important, but we have a broader issue that's not being addressed. And I think a format like this allows us to remember both the individual humanity of all refugees, but also realizing that this is also a broader phenomenon that we can't only address by helping one person or 2 people.
As well as condensing, crystallizing, I like that because I spend so much time after 20 years of writing comic strips. If I ever get employed to do journalism, I can't make the word count anymore because everything I do is the minimum number of words. Yeah. So I find it really hard to waffle when writing. The other thing that I use is humor, which is, and it's something that everybody associates with comics, but I deliberately change the tone from time to time. Like there's this bit where I'm in the jungle and I'm drawing a portrait of this kid, and it's subsequently he gets trapped in a lorry, and his backstory is pretty tragic, and his immediate future is pretty tragic. But one of the things that I do at this point is that this is a bit of a book where I don't want to take the reader down too much. So I have, at that point, I have a bunch of guys playing invisible cricket in the background, in the foreground, right? So there's these Afghan lads, they just play cricket all the time, but they don't actually use a cricket ball or bat, they just throw balls to each other and they go like that, So I intersperse this kind of like comedy with this kid's tragic backstory, and part of the reason why that I do that is that I keep the narrative lighter and then I take it darker and up again. And that's one of the things which makes this a graphic novel, not just straight graphic reportage. Because quite a lot of graphic reportage and quite a lot of graphic memoir consists of, like the graphic reportage is, and then we did this, and then we did that, and then we did something else. And quite a lot of the graphic memoir is, and then this happened, and then that happened, and then another thing happened. But what makes a graphic novel is when the reader goes somewhere with you. And that's part of what I do in the way that I work. And as my friend Rosie Cleavage, housewife, superstar, and mother of 3 says, if you can make someone laugh, then you're halfway to changing their minds.
Did you want to?
No, I just want to say that I agree with Maryam and Kate that it's kind of important to put a face, put a face to the numbers, and I think this is what we are missing. Thank you for this.
Thank you.
And thank you all. Thank you all for coming. Again, there are books available. I'm not paid to say it's wonderful. Please help yourself. Thank you all.